Now that we've learned about nested serializers, we're going to move on to add in the functionality so that we can create tags via our recipe API. The first thing we're going to do, as always, is create some unit tests that allow us to test the functionality. So let's open up the app slash recipe slash tests, and we're actually going to add these tests inside our test recipe API instead of the test tags API. And the reason for that is because we're going to support creating tags directly through our recipe. So when people are using the API, typically they're going to be creating new recipes. We're going to allow them to specify tags in that recipe. And if those tags don't exist, we're going to create them and assign them to the recipe. And if those tags do exist, we're going to assign the existing tags to the new recipe that's been created. So let's go ahead and add a test for that to the bottom of this tests recipe API.py module. The first thing we need to do is add some imports to the top of the file. So here where we have from core.models import recipe, we're going to add some brackets here and break them onto multiple lines. And underneath recipe, we're going to add tag to import our new tag model. Then at the bottom of the file, I'm going to scroll right to the bottom and level with the existing method that exists here. We're going to add def test create recipe with new tags. And we're going to have self as the argument here. And then test creating a recipe with new tags as the doc string. Now we're going to create the test payload that we're going to use to test with our recipe API. So we'll do payload equals, and we're going to use title, Thai prawn curry, and then time minutes, we'll say it takes 30 minutes. And then price, we'll have decimal 250. And then tags, we're going to pass in a list of objects here, so a list of dictionaries. First one with name is Thai, and the second one is going to be name dinner. So these are two tags that are going to be created and assigned to the recipe. Thai, which is the type of cuisine, and dinner, which is the time that you might want to eat this meal. Next, we're going to add res equals self.client.post recipes URL. So we're going to post this to the recipes URL. I'm going to pass in the payload. And because we're providing nested objects here, we want to set format equals JSON. So just to make sure it gets converted to JSON and it is successfully posted to the API. Okay, so that's all we need to do to set up the test. Now we're actually going to test the result of the test. So we'll do self.assert equal res.status code should be status.http 201 created, and then recipes equals recipe.objects.filter, and we'll filter by user equals self.user. There's the authenticated user. Then we'll do self.assert equal recipes.count 1, and then recipe equals recipes 0, and self.assert equal recipe.tags.count 2, and then for tag in payload tags, I'm going to do exists equals recipe.tags.filter, filter by name equals tag name, and then user equals self.user. And we'll make sure we call the exists method on that filter, and self.assert true exists. Okay, so I'll just talk through what this does here. So first we're setting up the payload, and then we are posting that payload to the recipes API. Then after that, we have assert that the response code was HTTP 201 created, which is what we expect when we create new objects. And then we are filtering all of the recipes that are currently assigned to the authenticated user, and we're checking that the count of those recipes is 1. After that, we then assign the recipe variable to the first item that was returned in recipes. And the reason why we're checking on this line 212 here is because if we didn't check this and the recipe wasn't properly created, then the test is going to throw an error when we try and retrieve the first result from the recipes here on 213. And that would give you kind of a generic index error, saying the index wasn't found for this variable. And that would essentially test the same thing, except it doesn't give as much information to the user if the test fails. So in order to provide more information and to make it clearer as to why the test failed, we have this additional assert statement here, assert equals, to make sure the correct count of recipes was created or exists in the database at this point before we actually try and retrieve the first item from those recipes. Next, what we're doing is checking that there are 2 tags assigned to the new recipe that was created. So there should be 2 tags here because one is Thai and the other is dinner. And if there's any other number of tags, then we know that something's wrong. So we just make sure that there are 2 tags assigned to the recipe. Then what we do is we loop through each tag that we expect to be created. So that's these 2 tags here. We loop through each of those and we check that they exist. So we want to make sure that they exist with the correct name and user. This will tell us not only that 2 tags were assigned to the recipe, but the correct names were also assigned to those tags and the correct user owns those tags. So it makes sure that the functionality is working as expected. Okay, so this is for creating brand new tags that don't exist. Next, we're going to add a test to test what happens if we assign an existing tag to the recipe. When the user is creating a new recipe, if they use a tag that already exists in the database, we don't want it to recreate that tag and have a duplicate in the database. We want it to reuse that tag and just assign that tag to the new recipe that was created. This will avoid us having lots of duplicate values in the database. So we're going to add a test for that now. Below this test create recipe with new tags, we're going to add a new test case, def test create recipe with existing tags. Self and then test creating a recipe with existing tag. And now what we'll do is we'll first create a tag. So we'll do tag underscore Indian. That's going to be the name of the tag equals tag.objects.create user equals self.user name equals Indian. So this is going to be a recipe for an Indian meal. And we'll have payload equals, and then title, we'll call this Pongal, which is a type of Indian breakfast, I believe. Apologies if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. And then we'll do time minutes 60, and then price decimal 450. Then we're going to add tags, and we're going to assign 2 tags, or pass in 2 tags here. One is name, and that first name is going to match this tag that we created up here. So name Indian. And then we're going to have a second tag that doesn't already exist. So we'll do name breakfast. Okay, so now we'll do below the payload, we'll do res equals self.client.post recipes URL payload and format JSON. All right, so what we would expect here is that we have a payload for a new recipe, and that recipe has 2 tags in the payload. So we already created 1 tag up here, which is one of the tags that's being used. Providing the name matches, we would expect this tag to be assigned to the new recipe as opposed to creating a new tag with this name. And because we don't already have a breakfast tag, we would expect that tag to be additionally created. So the point here is that we wouldn't expect there to be 3 different tags. We would expect there to be 2 tags at the end. So now let's add the assert statements. So we'll do self.assert equal. The first one is going to be res.statuscode status.http 201 created. So we expect it to create a new recipe and return 201 created. And then recipes equals recipe.objects.filter user equals self.user. Now we do self.assert equal recipes.count 1, so we expect 1 recipe to exist, and then recipe equals recipes 0, so we'll get the first result from the recipes that we returned, and then self.assert equal recipe.tags.count 2, So there should be 2 tags associated with that recipe. And then we do self.assertIn recipe.tags, or assert in tag underscore Indian, and then recipe.tags.all. So this ensures that this specific tag that we created exists in the tags that are assigned to the recipe. So this is really the unique functionality that we're testing here. We're testing that it's actually reassigning this tag to this recipe and not creating a new one. Then we're going to do the same loop as we did before. So we'll do for tag in payload tags exists equals recipe.tags.filter, name equals tag name, and then user equals self.user. And then we'll call the exists method, and self.assertTrue exists. Okay, so if you save the file, now open up the terminal, we can run the tests. So we can run docker compose run rm app sh-c python manage.py test. Let's go ahead and run that and make sure it fails as we expect, because we didn't implement the feature yet. Okay, so we got 2 failures here. That is that the recipe tags count was 0 when we expected it to be 2, and that's because we haven't added this feature yet. So this is failing as we expect. So that's the test that we need to create for this feature. Let's move on and actually implement the feature.